Hello, my name is Paolo di Lucia.
And my name is Lorenzo Passerini.
We will present a paper called Society and Nature Revisited. The paper is divided in 5 parts.
Let's start with the first part about Philippe Descola and his anthropology of the distinction between nature and cult. Philippe Descola is a French anthropologist who succeeded to Claude Lévi-Strauss on the chair of anthropology at the Collège de France. He has recently denied the universal relevance of our notion of nature and its antithesis to culture. Descola was visiting Chumpi's house on the river Kapawi in Amazon when Chumpi's wife was bitten by a snake. For Chumpi, this didn't happen by chance. It was, on the contrary, the vengeance of one of the mothers of a game watching over the destinies of a forest animal. Because Chumpi, in the previous day, effected a massacre of woolly monkeys with a newly acquired shotgun. Chumpi explained to Descola that woolly monkeys, howler monkeys, all the creatures that we kill in order to eat are persons, just as we are. They live together among their own relatives. Nothing they do is by chance. They talk among themselves. They listen to what we say. They intermarry in a proper fashion. In vendettas, we too, explained Chumpi, kill relatives by marriage, but they are still relatives. They too can wish to kill us. Likewise with woolly monkeys, we kill them for food, but they are still relatives. So exceeding in killing monkeys is like a murder. This is typical of animistic mentality. In animistic ontology, most plants and animals possess a soul similar to that of humans. This constitutes a faculty that classifies them as persons, in that it provides them with a reflexive awareness and intentionality. Thus, animals and plants are not mindless beings. They have an intentionality which allows them to live according to sets of rules and normative relationships, some of which they share with human beings. In that the category of person includes spirits, plants, and animals, this cosmology does not discriminate between human beings and non-human beings. In this circumstance, Descola wonders, is the description of natural beings any more than a linguistic convenience? Is there any place for nature in a cosmology that confers most of the attributes of human beings upon animals and plants?
Hans Kelsen, The Divorce of Nature from Society. Descola reconstructions of animism was anticipated by the Austrian legal philosopher Hans Kelsen in his book Society and Nature, published in 1943. Hans Kelsen is one of the most influential legal philosophers, notably for his pure theory of law. For Kelsen, law is a social phenomenon, and in his elaboration of the pure theory of law, he offers an articulated epistemological and ontological account not only of legal systems, but also of other normative social orders, such as moral and religious orders, as well as of social phenomena in general. Kelsen has devoted great attention to primitive social orders and to primitive mentality, as is testified especially by his aforementioned work, Society and Nature. One of the main tenets of this book is that our thinking is characterized by a fundamental dualism, society and nature. Society and nature, if conceived of as two different systems of elements, are the results of two different methods of thinking and are only as such two different objects. Nature, according to Kelsen, is a particular order of things, or a system of elements connected with one another as a cause and effect. That is to say, according to the specific principle which is called causality. An example is if a metallic body is heated, it expands. And the logical structure of this sentence is if there is A, cause, there is or will be B, effect. Natural science interprets the connections between facts according to this specific principle. If there is A, there is B. The connection between cause and effect is independent of any act of a human or superhuman being. Kelsen advances an important thesis, according to which the idea of causality is not an innate idea. Causality is the achievement of a relatively advanced civilization. And it is very probable that primitive man does not think at all in terms of causality. The principle of causality, this is a second main thesis of the book by Kelsen, has its origins in the norm of retribution. What is a norm of retribution? According to Kelsen, early man interprets the facts perceived by his sense according to the same principle which determine his relation to his fellow man, that is to say, according to social norms. So all the facts and events are interpreted according to this norm of retribution. If you behave rightly, you ought to be rewarded. If you behave wrongly, you ought to be punished. According to the norm of retribution, the primitive man interprets those happenings which directly affect him, such as illness, accidents, and death, as well as the cosmic phenomena as thunder, lightning, volcanic eruption, tempests, above all the longed-for rain, and finally the sun, the moon, and the stars. All natural phenomena are related to social events and are interpreted as punishment. Now we would like to stress the explicative import of the norm of retribution. In the different phases of the development of the scientific mentality, we can observe an evolution from a principle that we could formulate as no punishment without guilt to a principle which is no event without guilt. So we could say that the principle of retribution functions in the mentality of the primitive man as a principle of sufficient reason. If misfortunes occurs, a primitive wonders what was the guilt, and that recalls that the Greek word aikia means both guilt, on the other hand, cause. Kelsen distinguished causal and personalistic thinking. He described causal thinking as that thinking that tried to answer the question, how did it happen? And personalistic thinking, the answer to the question, who did it? So the cause is an objective event homogeneous to the effect and like it occurring in nature. Whereas in the case of the personalistic thinking, primitive man traces events which he wishes to understand not to elements of the same kind, but to elements of the different kind, not to an object, but to a subject, not to a thing, but to a person. One way of thinking, personalistic, excludes the other one, causal thinking. According to Kelsen, the explicative import of the norm of retribution explains why the norm of retribution can be considered the origins of the principle of causality. And Kelsen advanced the thesis that the development of a scientific mentality is represented by the emancipations of the law of causality from the principle of retribution. Together with this emancipation, we can observe the divorce of the notions of nature and society. Nature and society prove to be two entirely different systems, whose difference rests on the fact that the phenomena, and especially human behavior, are interpreted according to two different kinds of laws.
Let's get to the third part, the epistemic foundation of social phenomena. Paolo has shown us that what we call nature is, for Kelsen, an order of things connected to one another according to the principle of causality, which is an epistemic principle. Society is, on the contrary, an order of facts or things connected to one another according to a different principle. It is only by adopting this different epistemic principle that one can recognize social phenomena. According to Kelsen, if we analyze our propositions concerning human behavior, we find that we connect them with one another and with other facts, not only and exclusively according to the principle of causality, but according to another principle, quite different from that of causality, a principle for which science has not yet established a recognized term. This principle, that Kelsen dubs the principle of imputation, is a normative principle. Causal remarks, indeed, that it is a fundamental fact that when men live together with other men in a group, in their minds, the idea arises that some behavior is right and some behavior is wrong, or in other terms, that the members of a group ought to behave under certain circumstances in a certain way. It is a fundamental fact that men living in a group interpret their mutual behavior according to such norms. Thus, according to Kelsen, society is a normative order. Men belong to such a society only insofar as their behavior is determined by the norm of retribution. The norm of retribution is indeed a paradigmatic exemplification of a principle of imputation. If a delicт has been committed, a sanction ought to be executed. Or the logical form is, if there is A, a delict, there ought to be B, a sanction. It is very important to remark that the connection between the condition, the delict, and the consequence, the sanction, is established by acts of human or superhuman beings. Normative social sciences, that is, sciences that describe systems of norms, interpret the connections between facts according to the principle of imputation. The sanction is imputed to an act or fact which consequently is qualified as a delict. So let's get back to the epistemic foundation of a social phenomenon. According to Kelsen, as we have seen, society and nature, if conceived as two different systems of elements, are the results of two different methods of thinking and are only as such two different objects. Kelsen remarks indeed that the same elements connected with each other according to the principle of causality constitute nature. Connected with each other according to another, namely a normative principle, they constitute society. Thus, the dualism between society and nature is not transcendent in character. It is transcendental. It depends on the epistemic principles that are used to interpret phenomena. Let's now get back to the question of animistic culture. In animistic cultures, there is a form of monism. That is, nature is interpreted in a normative way. In Kelsen's reconstruction, animism consists in the belief that all things have a soul, are animated, and that things react towards man like human beings act in their mutual relation. That is, according to the norm of retribution. The essence of animism is a personalistic, and that means a socio-normative interpretation of nature, an interpretation not according to the principle of causality, but according to the principle of imputation. Kelsen's view is very similar to Descola's analysis of animistic cultures. Kelsen remarks that primitive man frequently regards the killing of an animal in the same way as the murder of a man. He tries, as best as he can, to avoid the menacing retribution by undergoing purification and expiation ceremonies after a hunting expedition. What is the conclusion drawn by Kelsen? For a primitive man, that which is nature within the meaning of natural science is part of his society as a normative order. The conclusion of Kelsen is the same as the conclusion of Descola. There is no such thing as nature in the sense of modern science. The dualism of society and nature is foreign to primitive mentality. So, in animistic cultures, the ontology is a monistic ontology. There is no nature, there is only society, and society includes animals and plants. As we have seen, the emancipation of a principle of causality from the norm of retribution led to the overcoming of such an animistic monism and to the development of our dualistic ontology. Kelsen remarks, though, that a part of modern science tends to an opposite form of monism, in which also human behaviors are interpreted exclusively according to the principle of causality. Thus, if in the beginning there was nature as part of a society, now the tendency is to conceive society as a part of nature. This is typical of causal social sciences, that is, sciences that investigate society only according to the principle of causality. A typical example is the sociology of law. From this viewpoint, Kelsen remarks, merely the natural, causally connected events and the legal acts merely in their actuality as empirical perceivable facts, but not their specific meaning, are taken into consideration. From this viewpoint, according to Kelsen, norms do not exist, and the statement that this or that ought to be has no meaning. But this has some implications. The causal interpretation of human behavior implies that the meaning of an act in which the legal authority commands, authorizes, or positively permits something can scientifically be described only as an attempt to create in man certain ideas whose motivating power causes them to behave in a certain way. But if all meaning is denied to the norm, to the ought, then it would be senseless to say, this is legally permitted, that is forbidden. This belongs to me, that to you. If one adopts exclusively the causal perspective, the thousands of statements in which the law is expressed daily would be senseless.
From the understanding to the construction of social reality. Kelsen shows that an interpretation of reality exclusively based on the principle of causality does not enable us to understand the specific meaning of social phenomena. Social phenomena can only be conceived of and understood in virtue of the normative interpretation of phenomena, ultimately based on the principle of imputation. The transcendental aspect appears very clearly when Kelsen talks about the norm as a scheme of interpretation. According to Kelsen, in every fact that is interpreted as a legal fact, two elements can be distinguished. One, an act or a happening occurring at a certain time and in a certain place, perceived by our senses, a natural phenomenon determined by causality. For example, people assemble in a large room, make speeches, some raise their hands, others do not. And on the other hand, the legal meaning of this act or fact. For example, in that case, the meaning that a statute is being passed. This meaning is not perceivable by our senses, and it is conferred to that act or fact by a norm. What are the ontological implications of Kelsen's transcendental conception of social phenomena? Kelsen seems to imply that the very existence of norms and of social phenomena depends on a specific interpretation of natural facts. The interpretation through norms and ultimately through the principle of imputation. So this is a transcendental, not a transcendent conception of social phenomena. And these phenomena, norms and social phenomena, belong to a realm that Kelsen characterized as ideal existence, as opposed to the material existence. And this ideal existence, proper to an autonomous sphere of meanings, is what characterizes norms and social phenomena. Social phenomena depend on normative interpretations, as we have seen, and thus they are mind-dependent and, in Searle's sense, ontologically subjective. But this is a second question. How can mind-dependent social phenomena be objective? Kelsen introduces a distinction between a subjective legal meaning and an objective legal meaning. He conceived subjective legal meaning as that meaning that the person who acts conferred to his act. An act of human conduct can carry a self-interpretation. It can include a statement indicating its legal meaning, for example, the meaning of a testament. But this subjective legal meaning may, but need not necessarily coincide with its objective meaning. And what is objective meaning? Objective legal meaning is the meaning that the act has according to valid legal norms. The science of law is specifically directed to the objective knowledge of valid legal norms and of corresponding objective legal meanings. But what is a valid norm? A norm is valid if and only if it has been created through a specific procedure determined by the other meta-norms of the system. According to Kelsen, the meta-norms are themselves valid if and only if they are created through the valid procedure. But this implies a problem of the regressus in infinitum. In the theory of Kelsen, the regressus infinitum is interrupted by the idea of a basic norm of the normative system. And the basic norm is not a created norm, but it is necessarily presupposed by the science of law in order to understand a system of norms as a valid system of norms. It's a fundamental presupposition of the juristic interpretation of certain phenomena. This Kelsenian conception of legal phenomena implies that the epistemic objectivity of legal meanings depends on the existence of a reference system of norms. A phenomenon is not a legal phenomenon individually and in itself, but only through the mediations of the transcendental function of the basic norm of the system. And this is a third question we formulate. Can this view be extended to all social phenomena, as Kelsen seems to suggest? Thank you very much.